Okay? Anybody need a headset? If you need a headset, se você precisa ter a tradução, por favor, busca agora. Lucho, você precisa, eu sei. Vai pegar os que necessitam tradução, os que necessitam um pouco de beleza, porque está filmado. Sou eu, mas tá bom. Ele também. Tá bom. Veja, a ideia para esse 2 horas temos? Até 4:30? É ele que controla. Obrigado, Connie. A ideia é de utilizar essas 2 horas não para falar sobre o que funciona, é para falar sobre o que precisamos fazer, o que podemos fazer. Para mim, é a discussão mais rica que podemos ter. E eu não quero realmente liderar, eu quero que nós construímos junto a ideia de como trabalhar. Eu pensei que tem algumas áreas de trabalho. É o que fazemos sobre o COP, porque o COP não funciona. E o ano próximo, aonde vai ser? Quem sabe, a partir dele? Quem sabe que o COP... Tienes tradução? Inglês? Não, portunhol. Eu falar portunhol. I'm going to get shit here. No,
¿Puedes hablar en español?
Además habla muy buen español. Sí. No sé por qué empezó a hablar portugués.
They couldn't handle my portuñol because it's too messed up. So I'm going to have to speak in English. But they do have French and Spanish translation, so for those of you who need it. So look, the issues I was thinking of, one is we could spend a bit of time talking about the COP. Is there anything we can do that is different than the COP? Because I know there's some ideas floating around about what ways do we engage the COP, but I really don't want to spend a lot of time on that. So if we have a few minutes, we could think about that, or not. Maybe not? Okay. So, the other ideas is clearly we're here under a public services remit. So what is it that we need to do to focus public services on solving the climate crisis? What sort of initiatives do we need to take? How do we structure ourselves? Because the idea is that when we leave here, we stay connected digitally, at least, so that we don't have to always fly all over the world. And we help each other build our campaigns through the digital sides of them. And also connecting on the ground, depending which country you're from, we then connect and strengthen our campaigns. But for me, that would be one overarching subject of what elements of cooperation should we prioritize for the coming couple, 3 years? Is that something that can start a conversation, or am I still farting around? There's a microphone here for whoever wants to grab it. Rodrigo, give me a hand here. Grab the microphone and say something deep and meaningful.
Okay, so I feel it's... puedo hablar en español. Yo hablo español y no
Sí, tú
portugués.
puedes hablar español. Español sí, portuñol no.
Ya, creo que está interesante como la conversación, como cómo podemos agarrar esta discusión sobre justicia climática y vincularla con servicios públicos. Y yo propongo al menos dos campos. Uno, que es algo que hemos estado conversando un poco yo soy Rodrigo de la Iniciativa Global, con Ale, que es colega mía, y que tiene que ver con los servicios públicos no solamente en cuanto impactan o no impactan el cambio climático, sino como los servicios públicos como un elemento central de economías sustentables. Es decir, una economía que se está moviendo de un patrón consumista y extractivista, la pregunta es hacia dónde avanza. No todas las economías son iguales, no porque tienen el mismo PIB per cápita son iguales, sino que tienen distintas composiciones. Y creo que hay un horizonte de una economía sustentable en donde probablemente el porcentaje de la economía que corresponde a servicios públicos va a ser más grande. Es decir, vamos a hacer probablemente menos iPhones y vamos a tener sistemas de salud más grandes o un sector de transporte o de vivienda más desarrollado. Entonces creo que hay algo ahí que tiene que ver con esta visión de justicia económica más allá de redistribución, sino como justicia económica como otro tipo de economía, más enfocado en derechos humanos y menos enfocado en consumismo y extractivismo. Entonces propongo una mirada ahí para ponerlo sobre la mesa. Y el otro elemento que me parece muy interesante de la emergencia climática es que la emergencia climática ha calado fondo en las sociedades del mundo y se entiende como un desafío que requiere cooperación internacional. Es decir, tú le preguntas a cualquier persona en el mundo sobre, bueno, ¿qué hacemos con la emergencia climática? Y todos te van a decir, esto es un problema de todos, ¿ya? De todo el mundo. Es decir, ha abierto el campo para la cooperación internacional más de lo que se ha hecho en otras áreas. Y creo que hay un desafío ahí en vincular la emergencia climática con otros campos que requieren cooperación internacional. Me parece que el más obvio es, por ejemplo, lo de justicia tributaria, que se ha estado discutiendo ayer, hoy día también de alguna manera, en donde si logramos que la sociedad diga, la justicia tributaria sí tiene que ver con la emergencia climática, va a haber una aceptación más rápida de decir, requiere esa cooperación internacional que quizás no hemos hecho hasta ahora, pero que sí podemos desarrollar. Pero creo que el campo de cooperación internacional, y quizás eso responde un poco a lo que estaba preguntando David, bueno, ¿de qué se debiese tratar COP o cómo debiese ser COP? Es algo que podemos imaginar y explorar un poco más allá. Creo que pérdidas y daño en algún momento era algo que uno se imaginaba que no iba a lograr entrar así a la agenda y ser llevado adelante en una COP, y hoy día se está como ampliando el marco de lo posible en ese espacio. Entonces yo invitaría también a mirar un poco más allá, bueno, ¿qué espacios de cooperación internacional, qué sujetos de cooperación internacional nos interesaría pensar para la mirada más de servicios públicos? Eso.
Thank you. I knew you would say something helpful. That's good. Now, Archer, I know you had your hand up and I didn't go to you. And so I hope it's something helpful and leading us forward, but please.
You're just coercively forcing people to speak now, aren't you? I think it would be nicer if we were sitting in a different shape. That would be a better
Okay,
thing.
yeah, but look, I'm sitting here not because I'm moderating, but because these chairs are more comfortable. So I would invite at least other people to take comfortable chairs. If you sit beside me, I won't bite. So, señora, no, hang on. Okay, good. Come on, come on. And then the rest of you, for broken back chairs, people. Thank you, Archer.
Thank you. B,
Yeah,
David B, as we like to call you, rather than David A.
Yeah. Let's give them a minute to get it together before you share your profundities with us.
So, I'm going to, one of the things I think we absolutely must figure out is how to connect the climate justice struggles with the other struggles, both public service struggles and the economic justice and the care and feminist economic alternative struggles. One of the things, so I've got this slightly weird fantasy idea, but I think you start with a fantasy and then you work towards it, and things which seem impossible today might become possible tomorrow. And the seed of this is really the recognition now in the COP that there is a global debt from the global north, a debt to the rest of the planet, to the people across the global south, because of the historic role in pollution. This is a global debt which is at the moment unenforceable, and most of the way in which a lot of the climate finance talk is going to end up increasingly veering towards multilateral development banks, IMF, and actually lending money, so paying back a global debt by further indebting countries in the global south. This is such a grotesque contradiction. And I think it should be the catalyst for something which is much more fundamental. And I think it's the seed, there's a seed of an idea in saying we have long thought that the debt in the global south is something which is just like countries have no choice but to pay because they end up as pariah states. If they don't pay, they end up punished, they end up having to go to the IMF and then imposing austerity and cutting spending on public services. And what happens every time there's a debt crisis is countries get picked off one after another after another. So Zambia gets picked off today, and then we'll have Senegal and Sierra Leone and Ghana, and you have countries who simply end up submitting to the policies of austerity imposed by the International Monetary Fund. And these are the things, more than anything, that force cuts in public spending, particularly the public sector workforce. The default policy of all of these austerity conditions relate to cutting spending on the public sector workforce. So how long will it be until we actually have, and we can reach a moment where you get cooperation across countries in the global south saying, why do we just not suspend or cancel and refuse to pay our debt until the global north pays its much larger debt to the global south? Once you're framing everything in relation to debt, the global south could be saying, and you'd only need a few countries in Latin America, a few countries in Africa to come together boldly and say, we're not paying until you pay us. And if you do that, you break the entire system. You break the international financial architecture. There would be attempts by the credit rating agencies to punish every country involved, but if you have a critical mass of countries, it's very difficult to resist that. And it does seem to me to change the dynamic around what is the debt crisis, which is used so often as the catalyst for forcing cuts in public spending. It changes the dynamic fundamentally when we recognize, as increasingly is recognized, that the global north has got a much bigger debt to the global south. That debt comes in many other forms as well. We can talk about reparations in other ways, but I think the climate space is a really interesting space to really advance that discussion. So I'm optimistic myself, because I quite like fantasizing about these things, that you could get to a point where you get enough countries across the global south collaborating in a we're not paying until you pay. And that would be incredibly powerful.
A global debt strike. Raise your hand if you think that's a good idea. I think it's a great idea. I think it's a great idea. So who would you put as your first leading countries?
Well, Colombia, and you go for the progressive governments in Latin America, combined with the most indebted countries in Africa. If you look at some of the politics of the way in which debt is talked about by ministries of finance in Africa, I think we're not far away. The fact that the Africa Union, ministers of finance, collectively called for a UN tax convention and managed to push it through the UN emboldens ministers and countries in Africa to come up with propositions and be bold in pushing that forward. But I think they also need to make that strategic link with countries in Latin America who have got the sort of political framing to take this even further.
I think it's a great idea.
Who are you?
I want to, Wissam Ahmed from Al-Haq, Palestine.
Thank you.
But I have a question with regard to how can this be connected to actions in the global north? What can be done in the global north to feed into this push? Because obviously it's going to be met with a lot of resistance. So if it's a global strike to not pay debt, and those in the global north that want to support the global south, they put the same demands and refuse to pay their debts to their credit card companies and their financial institutions. And let's see how the pressure evolves from the north and the south and converge in the middle.
Okay. Oh yeah, we need a reporter as well.
I mean, it's been a lot of men.
I'm going to try to take notes.
Yeah, the problem, I mean, I fully agree, but the
Can
problem
you,
with that...
sorry, we need to introduce each
I'm-
other as we speak, and
Sure.
for information, I'm David Boyes from PSI, but and he's
Claudio-
David Archer from ActionAid. Who are you?
Claudio Schuftan from the People's Health Movement.
Thank
Okay, I think that the problem, which I agree, this reneging the debt, is that most of the countries are hanging on the tit, and they need the system to go on for their economies to continue working. If the next tranche of whatever they are going to get in borrowing money, they probably would, their economies would collapse. But I wanted to make a comment on what Rodrigo said, and David picked up a little bit on, basically that this convergence that is happening among our social movements and civil society groups. It's certainly not happened in the United Nations, which has become less multilateral than it has ever been, and it has certainly not happened at the level of the states who vote in the United Nations. You probably know that in the last 15 or more years, the position of the countries of the South are systematically steamrolled by the countries of the North with, as you know, discussions that go until 3 o'clock in the morning or in the COP, another 24 hours, only to soften the language to make it less binding. And we have been picking up the pieces as civil society. So the increased participation and convergence that is happening, I mean, this conference is an example of it, is probably where the power has to grow to build counterpower to power.
Gracias, soy Emilia Reyes de Equidad de Género, México. I wanted to share with you an idea that is coming from the resource justice movement, which is cap, fee, and divest. I think there is a lot of need for really addressing the interlinkages between climate and the rest of the environmental emergencies. And I want to be very clear on this. Even if we stop climate change today, we are still on the verge of collapse, and we are still on the verge of extinction. Just because on the framework of analysis of planetary boundaries, climate change is only one of the 9, and biodiversity integrity has been way over the risk boundary, and we are really way over the extinction of biodiversity integrity that compounds not only life extinction, but also ecosystems integrity, and ocean acidification is about to go. So in summary, we have gone above 5 of the 9. And each one of those pulls the other in a chain reaction. And there are 2 that are mainstream or cross-cutting, which is biodiversity and climate change. So this is why climate change, alongside the biodiversity loss, is bringing us to the brink of extinction. But to me, this is really important, so that we don't talk about climate. We need to talk about ecology or environment or whatever term you prefer, because otherwise the measures we're going to do are not going to be enough. And this is something that is really pressing from my point of view. And the second thing I wanted to share is this idea precisely of cap, fee, and divest, because the idea is, for instance, as I was saying, just for the need of lithium and cobalt, I mean, Chile is a great example. I think it owns 80% of the lithium in the world. And so imagine the massive extraction that is going to be needed to fund the energetic transition in the north. Because what we are seeing is that they are actually expanding the energy consumption precisely because they're using renewables and fossil fuels. But just to feed on the minerals that are going to be needed, massive mining is going to happen. But then the resource justice theory is saying that the global north is responsible for the 72% of material resource use in the world. 72%. Of those, 50% happens in the global south. And this is really key because the global north is not only responsible of the 92% emissions of carbon, but is also responsible of the destruction of all of the biodiversity. So the proposal is to gather against sovereignty in the global south by capping material resource use, meaning in our countries, whenever there is not a major bet on survival of your economy, for instance, on lithium or on cobalt, or even I'm thinking this can also be applied for agriculture, a specific product, etc. The need for our governments in the South to start gaining sovereignty and capping the extraction. And every year they should lower the cap. And whenever someone gets closer to that cap, they need to pay a fee. And of course, even more if they go above. So that goes with the principle of the polluter pays. But more importantly, the divesting part is really important because that will get you additional funding that is not ODA, that is not polluter, that is not taxation, that is immediate available resources that can be gathered at the municipal level, at the national, regional, and global level. And that can fund many things, including loss and damage, but that would be a minimum element of all of the funding that is needed for public services, for natural restoration, etc. So to me, this is very major, and I want to conclude with an example. In Mexico, after the war in Ukraine, global corporations came and tried to extract lithium. And so they started to murder many environmentalists on the ground, and journalists started to cover that, and they were threatened as well. So the president one day just came up, and with a presidential bill, they capped the extraction of lithium in Mexico, and they forbade for foreign corporations to extract lithium. And that was done in a day. And to me, this is something that can expand the sovereign field of a country. And of course, the Mexican government just capped and never added the fee. But I think we need to come up with joining a new ideas on how are we going to fund loss and damage in a manner that is not debt, that is not ODA, because it's going to be peanuts, but also the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund is nothing. 100 billion, it's nothing, it's stupid. And there is a negotiation again on the new collective and quantifiable finance goal, but it's going again on bonds, which is again an instrument of debt. So how are we going to bring about new ideas? I think this agenda of resource justice is bringing a very key element that is not only relying on minerals, but how can we expand it on agriculture or in any field of commodity, and related to every dimension of also on ownership for how are we producing technology in the South, because now the South is actually building all of the cars and all of the computers and everything. So I think that can gain us a lot of ground in terms of political bargaining, but this also needs to start in a collective manner. So just wanted to put it on the table because each sector can really engage in something like this, and this opens up a new field of finance that is not in the usual ways.
Hola, buenas tardes a todas y todos. Soy Rodrigo Guerrero, de Espacio Público. Me sumé recién ayer a la conferencia. Les doy las gracias a las organizadoras, a todos los conferencistas. Ha sido sumamente enriquecedor poder escucharles. Y bueno, yo creo que al menos intentar compartir dos reflexiones. Quizás la primera tiene que ver por este debate constante que se ha dado, que tiene que ver respecto a lo público, que es justamente lo público es del Estado, lo público es de lo comunitario. Hoy día desde Chile, pero también desde Colombia, desde distintos países de América Latina, estamos reimpulsando, digamos, está tomando fuerza, después de varios años el Acuerdo de Escazú. Yo creo que es una instancia sumamente importante para poder volver a potenciar lo que tiene que ver con participación, poder, en ese sentido, bueno, superar primero que todo las instancias de participación en el contexto de la evaluación de proyectos concretos a nivel territorial. Eso es fundamental y de hecho son muchos pendientes, pero también tenemos que aprovechar este tipo de discusiones para poder pensar más allá de la participación, más allá de los proyectos concretos, precisamente extractivistas. Perdón, me sale lo chileno hablando rápido. Precisamente creo que Escazú bueno, es un instrumento fundamental, pero también una coyuntura que nos puede llevar a repensar lo público, en el sentido de poder sacar la participación solamente de proyectos concretos de desarrollo para poder pensar proyectos de desarrollo territorial, que es algo que de hecho en Chile nos falta y estoy seguro que en distintos países, bueno, del sur, pero también del mundo en general. Creo que esa es una buena instancia, una buena invitación también para poder apropiarnos de esos debates que hoy día se están viviendo día a día. Ahora en abril viene la COP extraordinaria de Escazú y creo que es una oportunidad para poner ese tipo de discusiones de nuevo sobre la mesa. Y la segunda discusión, que estoy seguro que se ha dado en distintos márgenes, pero como les digo, me vengo recién sumando, así que si repito algo que se haya dicho, lo siento. Pero me parece que el litio es una súper buena ejemplo de todas las dificultades que nos trae la transición. Primero, por las disputas, digamos, por las apropiaciones del concepto de transición justa que implica, porque justamente, como bien se ha dicho, una cosa es la transición a nivel global, la reducción de emisiones de carbono, pero ¿qué es lo que pasa en los territorios? En ese sentido, por supuesto, está la distinción de la transición justa a nivel global y a nivel del sur global, norte global, sur global, pero también a nivel de localidades y metrópolis. En ese sentido, por ejemplo, las distintas medidas de transición energética en Chile, la electromovilidad, que por supuesto es loable, se da en las grandes ciudades, pero se da en contra de los proyectos que se dan en los pequeños territorios. Entiéndase los salares, que es de donde se extrae el litio, que en ese sentido también hay que pensar los desafíos de la transición y cómo dinámicas extractivistas de minería dura se transforman hoy día, por ejemplo, en minería del agua. Hay también cómo pensamos los ecosistemas. Y en ese sentido también, por polemizar un poco, cómo podemos romper la romantización de, por una parte, las prácticas estatales, que en ese sentido en Chile la minería estatal y no estatal ha sido igualmente devastadora en los territorios, pero también el rol de las comunidades. Muchas veces las comunidades, hoy día, sobre todo, bueno, contexto liberal, 2022, muchas comunidades están muy fragmentadas, muchas veces la participación y, digamos, mediante la cooptación en base a recursos con las empresas privadas, tampoco asegura, en determinadas ocasiones, por supuesto no siempre, pero no siempre asegura que los ecosistemas se vayan a conservar. Entonces también ahí está el rol de la ciencia, de los centros de estudio, bueno, como espacio público, como acá las distintas ONG que están aquí presentes, que se pueden integrar al debate y aportar, ojalá, en conjunto a las comunidades, pero también poniendo los límites, porque justamente hoy día parte de las grandes discusiones paradigmáticas tienen que ver con estos límites, en ese sentido las negociaciones en las COP, las negociaciones en las distintas instancias multilaterales tienen que ver con ponernos límites y que por supuesto es ir directamente contra el dogma económico que sabemos que es el que reina y cómo podemos hacer desde ahí también proyectos viables a nivel económico, a nivel de Estado, a nivel de comunidades locales, por supuesto. Por eso creo que es importante seguir masticando este diálogo público y cómo a partir de Escazú y de los distintos desafíos que enfrentamos podemos seguir repensando y, digamos, enfrentar esta crisis climática. Gracias.
Yeah, I think boycott is still one of the more powerful means by which we are able to send across very important messages related to climate change, related to human rights, and so on. David mentioned about boycotting, governments boycotting debt payments, and if we can come up with the numbers, then that would really be powerful. But what can I do as an individual, you know? And us as individuals. And I think boycott with a strong collective numbers can really send a very powerful message. I'll give an example. There was once a strike-breaking incident that was done by Nestle in our country. And we know Nestle is a global multinational corporation. There was a call to boycott all Nestle products, not only in my country, but globally. And it was packaged in the sense that, Nestle is also producing those infant formula milk, doing a lot of deception. And so even UNICEF was able to, join but of course, discreetly and silently, because they're also receiving maybe some funding from Nestle Global, and so we were able to bring Nestle down to their knees, and they were able to bring back those workers who were fired because they were striking, and so even as individuals, that can be felt if you have the numbers. And it's not difficult, no? It's not difficult because you can do it yourself, your family, your friends, your community. That can be done without any repercussion, doing strikes. Of course, you must be ready, you must be organized, you must be ready to face any consequence of such action. But this one, boycotting, is also, well, I think another example that we have in the Philippines is we have this online shopping, facility similar to Amazon, and they made a mistake of getting an endorser who endorsed in the election campaign the son of the fascist dictator in the Philippines. And so there was a massive, immediate boycott of that online shopping facility. And we were able to bring that online shopping down to their knees. They took off that endorser because they felt, and if we can do this, like for example with Coca-Cola, some of the biggest polluters globally, I had Coca-Cola last night. Probably I should now refrain from drinking Coca-Cola, and if that can send a powerful message across the world, I think, in our small ways, that could be effective. So I think boycott, we have been part of the boycott movement during our student days, the strike movement, which is actually, boycotting from working to have and force employers for collective bargaining and recognize workers' demands. So I think let's, in such small things in our community, as mentioned earlier, that could be a powerful way by which we can, address climate change. Thank you.
And what's your name?
Rene Raya from ASBAY.
From where?
Rene Raya, based in Manila, ASBAY. It's the Association for Basic and Adult Education in Asia Pacific region. Thank you.
Thank you.
I could just briefly, if I can.
Yeah, you got the microphone. Use it.
Let's then.
Gracias. Soy Luciana del Transnational Institute, español, perdón. No, de lo que decía la compañera, me parece que estamos en un momento clave donde hay algunas propuestas que son un poco complejas también para algunas organizaciones, porque, por ejemplo, esa propuesta que está circulando con respecto a cómo vincular la deuda externa con la ayuda climática, que vincula el armado de proyectos para el cambio y la transición energética, hay, por lo menos en el resto de América Latina, una campaña muy grande que es la campaña que, por ejemplo, ha encabezado siempre Jubileo Sur, que es no debemos, no pagamos, es una deuda legítima y somos acreedores ecológicos, históricos y somos acreedores. Entonces, también implica a veces las propuestas que tenemos que pueden servir para el norte global, a veces tenemos que también ser o buscar las maneras de dialogar con otras organizaciones que vienen trabajando estos temas. Porque, por ejemplo, en Argentina nosotros empezamos a escuchar esta propuesta y todas las organizaciones que desde sectores de la amplia izquierda hasta los organismos de derechos humanos plantean no al pago de la deuda externa de ninguna manera, porque aceptar cualquier canje es aceptar que la deuda existe y es una deuda que debemos. Entonces, también como para tener en cuenta elementos de esas propuestas que pueden quizás servir en algunas latitudes, pero no en los países que se han endeudado históricamente, incluido México también, ¿no? Pero como es para debatir porque sé que es algo que circula también. Y otro elemento que tiene que ver con lo que se planteaba antes del extractivismo y el litio, que lo hablábamos en el taller de energía que había, que hubo ayer a la tarde, el panel, que es pensar también cómo se vinculan los instrumentos internacionales en términos legales, es decir, los tratados de libre comercio, los tratados de inversión, que están armados especialmente para atar a los países para que, por ejemplo, no puedan apropiarse del litio para desde el sur generar la transición energética. Cuando nosotros vemos el acuerdo entre el Mercosur y la Unión Europea, y se hablaba de esta frase de vacas por autos, tiene un sentido, ¿no? En realidad, estos tratados lo que hacen es profundizar el extractivismo de los países del sur. En América Latina es clarísimo. No estoy diciendo que crearon el extractivismo, estoy diciendo lo profundizan. Porque lo que hacen es atar de manos a los estados para cualquier política pública de todo lo que se ha hablado en estos días aquí. Y por otra parte, garantizarse que entonces el Estado garantiza con seguridad jurídica la extracción del litio, por ejemplo, pero el acuerdo entre Chile y la Unión Europea, en su nuevo capítulo, que es el capítulo sobre Energy and Raw Materials, el capítulo sobre energía y materias primas, dice claramente y de manera explícita que Chile no puede tener ninguna política de precios, ninguna política de limitación a las exportaciones, que tiene que colaborar con la Unión Europea en el avance hacia el hidrógeno verde, y eso está en el capítulo y no es una especulación. Son 16 páginas de limitación a la política pública en la transición energética para Chile. Entonces Chile va a ser proveedor de litio para que la transición energética se haga en el norte y ellos nos vendan de vuelta los autos terminados que ya no se van a fabricar más en la región. Porque, por ejemplo, Brasil y Argentina, con el acuerdo Mercosur-Unión Europea, van a estar obligados a en 15 años liberalizar totalmente el sector automotriz. Entonces, vuelve a ser una matriz colonial que nosotros podemos, cuando incorporamos el análisis sobre el litio, también entender que estos tratados generan ese marco de encerrona, de límite, para los estados en la política pública que pueda generar una transición energética abierta, solidaria, participativa, democrática, ¿no? Eso como para agregar algunos elementos. Gracias.
Hola, Rodolfo Bejarano de Latindat. Continuando con lo que decía Luciana, creo que hay temas a los que hay que prestarle atención y que tal vez son controversiales. Efectivamente, al hablar, por ejemplo, de canje de deuda por clima o por naturaleza, hay muchas diferencias de opinión porque hay esa posición de que hay una deuda histórica, no debemos pagarla y aceptar un canje es validar eso. Pero también está el otro lado, es que ya hay algunas iniciativas oficiales de gobiernos como el de Colombia que están pensando en algo sobre eso, en algún tipo de canje, no se sabe todavía cómo, pero la pregunta sería para nosotros si vamos a sumarnos a ese tipo de movimientos. ¿Qué pasa si hay otros países que están en la Amazonía, como Perú, Colombia, Brasil, si se suman a ese tipo de iniciativas de canje de deuda, por ejemplo, para proteger la Amazonía? ¿Nos vamos a sumar? ¿Vamos a quedarnos de lado? Creo que esa pregunta hay que hacérnosla. Y además porque ya hay países que son sumamente vulnerables al cambio climático, como países del Caribe, que ya están haciendo este tipo de operaciones. Claro, son canjes de bonos por otros bonos. O sea, en realidad no es un desendeudamiento y no creo que eso solucione ni el tema climático ni la deuda, pero por lo menos están avanzando en algo, en algún tipo de negociación en ese sentido. Entonces creo que hay que tomar todos esos elementos para ver cuál sería nuestra posición al respecto.
Hola, soy María Paz Aedo del Centro de Análisis Socioambiental de Chile y querría poner esta conversación sobre instrumentos de financiación en el contexto del pie forzado del crecimiento económico sobre la base de nuestras conversaciones. Y quizá esta conversación puede resultar un poco extremadamente profunda respecto de la urgencia de tomar algunas decisiones, pero me parece que no tocar el punto de la obligación de crecimiento económico como meta compartida de los países nos obliga a aceptar por pragmatismo soluciones que tienen un problema ontológico, un problema a la base en su definición, que es la posibilidad de resolver por la vía del mercado cuestiones que tienen que ver con cómo nos vamos a relacionar con nuestros territorios de aquí a largo plazo y no solo en la inmediatez de la transición a la descarbonización. ¿Sí? Yo querría poner como ejemplo de este conflicto epistemológico algo que nos pasó ahora yendo a Magallanes a conversar con la comunidad cahuéscar, en donde uno de ellos nos dijo claramente que el problema del hidrógeno verde no es un problema mecánico, es un problema espiritual. Su definición fue, usted no puede romper la molécula del agua porque allí hay un ñen. Un ñen es un espíritu dentro de la comunidad cahuéscar. Hemos tenido aquí invitadas de los pueblos indígenas para hablar de esto y habitualmente no conversamos porque suponemos que eso está muy lejos, que en realidad es impracticable porque al momento de ponernos serios tenemos que mirar instrumentos, ¿sí? Esta conversación también apareció en Paraguay. La comunidad guaraní reclamaba que las compensaciones les son insuficientes porque no se puede evaluar el daño que ha generado la represa de Itaipú en la triple frontera. No tiene precio el desplazamiento, no tiene precio la vida de nadie. Si no ponemos la cuestión del crecimiento en el foco de la justicia, todas las soluciones van a dar por hecho que lo que tenemos que hacer es generar dinero de alguna forma. Por eso es que puede que haga sentido que es un bono u otro, una compensación u otra, porque no podemos en el escenario internacional actual tocar esta cuestión de fondo. Lo intentó hacer Irene Vélez en Colombia y ahora está impugnada por el Parlamento por poco seria, porque ¿qué hace una filósofa hablando de economía? El problema de la justicia climática es un problema además de justicia epistemológica. Hay una cuestión de percepción de lo que entendemos por tierra, lo que entendemos por naturaleza, lo que entendemos por pueblo, que se discute poco debajo de la urgencia de soluciones pragmáticas, de la urgencia de cumplir el Acuerdo de París, de la urgencia que hay por descarbonizar. Y mi percepción es que en la medida que sigamos en esta urgencia, en este mirar árboles no vemos el bosque. Y me gustaría ver que en algún punto tenemos alguna conexión de agenda para decir sí, es posible que tengamos que recurrir a soluciones pragmáticas en territorios afectados en lo inmediato, pero en el fondo tenemos que abrir la conversación a que en la medida que tengamos meta de crecimiento económico, esto va a seguir pasando, porque el crecimiento económico impone una demanda de energía y materiales que el planeta no resiste y esa deuda impagable la pagan nuestros pueblos con su vida. Eso.
Gracias. Soy Cesare Ottolini, el coordinador de la Alianza Internacional de Habitantes, que es una red global de movimientos sociales para el derecho a la vivienda. Tengo dudas. Tengo dudas cuando hablamos que para justicia social, económica y climáticas, por ejemplo, hablamos de bonos o hablamos de ese tipo de canje de deuda. Tengo dudas porque normalmente este tipo de canje de deuda para deuda climática y deuda que los países quieren pagar no va en pro de los pueblos, va en pro de las corporaciones o para pagar la deuda que es negra. No sabemos dónde es el hueco, cuáles son las causas, sí, pero dónde va a llegar el dinero no lo sabemos. Creo que es mejor enraizar nuestras batallas, intentamos focalizar, tenemos, nuestro futuro es público. ¿Por qué no pensamos y movilizámonos para un canje de deuda justo? Tú pagas tu deuda social, tu gobierno, no hago adjetivos sobre los gobiernos, tú pagas la deuda social, hay una falta de servicios públicos, de agua, de vivienda, de salud, de transporte, es una deuda inmensa. Tú tienes una deuda que tú has contraído con otros países, con los fondos, con la, etcétera, etcétera, etcétera. La condicionalidad que nosotros ponemos, que tendríamos que poner es, tú pagas la deuda implementando, financiando políticas de servicios públicos. Esto tendría que ser. Nosotros hemos tenido una pequeña experiencia en Nairobi hace unos años, una campaña, una gran campaña, cero desalojos, parándolo, durante un cierto periodo, justamente la gente no puede quedar años todavía viviendo en el chabolismo. Entonces empezamos y logramos una pequeña experiencia, 40 millones de euros, el total de la deuda bilateral entre Kenia e Italia, 40 millones, 15% para mejorar un barrio popular. Poca cosa, pero podría ser una idea, como otras cosas que se ha hecho con Perú. Este tipo de canje de deuda nos convence más. Debatimos sobre esta cosa. Gracias.
Thank you, Christine from Kenya. One thing I'd like to emphasize is the need to bring communities onto these discussions. One, do they understand what climate change mean? Do they understand the impact of this on the various aspects, be it health, be it education? And giving an example from a community in Kenya where we work, where the impact is felt at the community level. We have this pastoralist community and they have to keep moving. And the policies we are talking about, the debt level we are talking about, we need to break it down to them so that they are able to understand how does this affect me at the household level? How does it affect my generations to come? Because these are the same people who are fighting over pasture. These are the same people who are fighting over watering hole. And how does it escalate? How does it affect the entire spectrum? So I think even as we sit here and discuss how to go about this, whether we boycott, whether we abandon, then we also need to bring the communities at the core of discussion, at the core of implementation, because we cannot achieve anything if the community is not in this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Antonia. I'm with Education International, which is the Global Federation of Education Workers. And I'd like to hear whether anyone here is working on fossil fuel subsidies. Yeah, some. I'm asking because some of our members have suggested that as an area, not just for our work on the climate crisis, but actually also in the context of public services and the whole claim about there being no alternative and there being no public money. We know that globally, more money is invested in fossil fuel subsidies than in public education. And I'm pretty sure that there's some interesting comparisons to be done across public services. So curious to hear whether there's appetite from others to look into fossil fuel subsidies and the ways in which they don't only throw us deeper into the crisis, but also undermine what we're trying to do in terms of public services and a public future.
Hello, I'm Delphine Dorsey. I work for the Right to Education initiative, and it's maybe to add on some things that have been said, maybe with my colleague there from Kenya, I think was. You want me to stand up? And some discussion we had this week about what do we mean with public? What does it mean public? Because, you know, like there are all these questions about how the communities are public as well. And when we think sometimes public as the states, but me, I have a lot of struggle at the moment with that because the state is not defending the public at the moment. No, they are all for privatization. They are not defending all the topic we are talking now about climate change. We talked at the beginning with your question about COP, and we don't want to talk about COP because they are not doing anything to change the things. And I mean, I'm just questioning like how we can maybe rethink what publics mean, and public is not only the states, which I mean, I work for the Right to Education, and of course we truly believe like the states and has the obligation to implement education, but I have a lot of questions because I work, when I go to the UN is not defending human rights, you know, they are not defending climate change, they do everything for the private, so I would just wonder like how we can reflect together when we think now about our futuro es público. What does it mean? You know, what is public and how us as a community, not just at community level, at local level, but as a global community, beyond or on the side or together with the states, I think we need to change the politics. I think we need to deconstruct how the world is working with politics and how we can reflect on that together, maybe when we think about the future of public. So that is just a question. I don't have the answer, but I would like to put that on the table. Thank you.
Oof.
Muchas gracias. Muy buenas tardes, compañeras y compañeros. Miren, yo soy Luis Izarra Delgado, soy el secretario general de la Federación Nacional de Trabajadores de Agua Potable del Perú. Y yo intervengo resaltando la intervención que hace un momento ha hecho la compañera de Kenia, solicitando que en este debate debieran intervenir directamente las comunidades. Y yo no diría que intervengan las comunidades, como ella lo dijo, sino que también intervengan los sindicatos. Porque quienes salimos a las calles, quienes nos movilizamos, quienes enfrentamos, somos las organizaciones sindicales y muchas veces, ¿no? Veo muchos activistas que tienen perfectas ideas, hermosas ideas, pero que muchas veces quedan ahí. Por ejemplo, en Perú, yo les quiero contar brevemente que estamos luchando porque el gobierno ratifique el acuerdo de Escazú. Pero los primeros en estar en desacuerdo son los compañeros de la Amazonía. O sea, ellos no quieren, aprobar el acuerdo de Escazú, cuando realmente es a ellos que están luchando contra la tala de árboles y otra cosa que beneficiaría. Entonces creo yo que es fundamental que no solamente sea un acuerdo de alturas, sino que fundamentalmente debe ser un acuerdo desde las bases, desde las organizaciones, para poder enfrentar todo un sistema, todo un modelo económico neoliberal. Se ha dicho que hay una crisis climática, hay una crisis moral, hay una crisis financiera, estamos enfrentados a un caos, ¿no? Y creo que es fundamental, como dijo temprano David Boyce, el pueblo unido jamás será vencido, pero tenemos que unirnos en base a propuestas que sean reales, sinceras y francas, y además donde participe los pueblos, donde participen las organizaciones. Muchas gracias y disculpen mi sinceridad.
Thank you. Yes, I think that continuing with the conversation that we had and trying to think about what is the role of public services in responding to climate change and the broader environmental breakdown, we really we need to think about what we've been discussing in the last 2 days, in the sense of how public services really play a fundamental role in responding to these crises. When we think about food systems, how do we need to make them sustainable? How can we reduce emissions of greenhouse gas effects with renewable energies that are rights aligned, that are democratic? How can we center care at the center of our economic systems in order to, and our public services in order to provide for green caring jobs? So trying to ground more on what role does public services, what is this public pathway that we're trying to devise? How can we ground it more on specific policies in each one of the sectors that we have devised, and analyze how this cross-cutting theme of climate change, of the environmental breakdown, affects each one of the sectors, and how we can move forward using public services as our key tool towards a just transition. So just to try to ground that reflection more in the things and the discussions that we have been discussing in the past 2 days.
I'm Alve. I'm from Education Network Philippines. We're a coalition of CSOs working on public education policy reforms. One of our colleagues here mentioned about putting the community at the center of the discussion, because although we're talking about environment and although we're talking about climate, it's still the people that are affected and could actually respond initially at the household or community level in our discussions. One of the things that is done in the Philippines is the advocacy for sustainable tourism, including the community in the process of doing tourism master plan and protecting the environment that they work in. But we have this realization. I also work for a tourism consultancy in the Philippines aside from Education Network. But what we actually observe is that if you want to put the community in the discussion and in the movement, you have to think about giving them also sustainable livelihoods. You cannot take them away from cutting trees because that's the source of their livelihood without giving alternatives and thinking about what skills do they need to actually support or be in the sustainable tourism or be in another industry that is not extractive. Another thing that we've been like saying so much about renewable energy, but have we actually looked into the profile of the companies in the renewable energy? Because some renewable energy companies are working on extractive industries too. And that's double burden for us. You know, if you want to support RE, look into the profiles of their funders, of their other companies. And it's also important to really scrutinize and to really look into deeper into that.
Thank you. My name is Wanan Permpibun. I am from Climate Watch Thailand. I'm also a member of APMDD and APWLD. I'd like to draw the attention on what is really, really critical for the global south as well, which is on adaptation. And the public finance and also the public services would also be needed in order to build and strengthen the capacities of the local communities and infrastructure in adapting to the changing of the climate. It's not just only talking about renewables. Yeah? So that could also mean some of the cases that we have done together with the local communities. Sorry, you might hear it again. I talked about this yesterday. We talk about the finance. The government is providing tax holidays for big corporations who are investing on green, environmental, clean technologies, bio-circular economies, and those kind of stuff that has been branded as something good by the corporate sectors. And then we unpack all those cases, and communities get it right away. And they were saying that government are not getting the tax money in order to provide the social services and also what has been necessary for them to adjust themselves to impacts of climate change, but rather losing the money that should have been collected as tax incentives to the companies. So those are really, really, really sexy as well for the communities. And that is also partly because they are already vulnerable and they are already faced with all kinds of climate impacts. So I think if we could also link that to the reality on the ground, we could also get a move. And the other one is on the subsidies. We are also working on the subsidies, the same thing as well. We are looking at subsidies of the government and the private banks in Thailand, and how much money budget that the government is provided as an equity or bond or even loans, not loans like subsidies to the fossil fuel industries. And we found out together with the local communities as well that it has been a lot, rather than putting that money to other services, not to put on renewables, yeah, because to us, in order to invest on renewables, it must be money from outside the country, not using the money within the country or the national budget to work and to invest on renewables, because we are not causing the climate impact. So if you want us to go for 1.5 pathway, where is the money on that? So somehow it really need to unlock and to communicate together with the local communities and bring in what has been really touched and also a reality on the ground, and then that could also be possible.
Thank you. David Archer from ActionAid again. So two points. Firstly, on this global debt strike, I think if it was going to work, it would be premised on the countries in the global south saying, we're not going to pay any of our debts until the global north pay their debt. And what we're going to do is, instead of paying our debts, we are going to invest that money in human rights, sustainable development, livelihoods, and it would be based on a charter of commitments that the governments, progressive governments would make, because let's face it, it's only going to be progressive governments who are going to sign up to this sort of initiative in the first place. I think you could actually connect many of these different struggles in quite an interesting way. You'd have governments saying, this is what we're going to do, instead of paying the debts to the global north, because this is the only way that we can enforce at the moment what's an unpayable, unenforceable debt that the global north have to us. So instead of that, this is what we're going to do with the money that otherwise would have been leaving our coffers, and which blocks credible public spending. Secondly, I think linking the question of subsidies and also boycotts, the biggest subsidies to the fossil fuel industries come from banks and in the market, and one of the biggest actors in global markets are pension funds, and particularly, ironically, public sector pension funds. The public sector pension funds are some of the biggest global actors in the market, and they are often investing in fossil fuels. There is a grotesque contradiction in that, because we know that if those fossil fuel investments carry on, we're going to end up with people who are investing in a pension, thinking about 20, 30 years ahead, they're going to be living on a planet which is not livable in. So it is absolutely grotesquely contradictory for pension funds in particular to be investing in the fossil fuel industries. And I think there's one of the very interesting pieces of research I saw suggested that what's the most powerful thing you can do as an individual, particularly, in fact, in the global north? Is it to become a vegan? Is it to stop flying? No, the most effective thing you can do is to change how the steer that you give to your pension fund and to stop them investing in fossil fuels and extractive industries. That is an incredibly powerful act that can transform, and it actually has more impact on your carbon footprint than almost anything else that you can do. So mass movements to call and put pressure on public sector pension funds. And here, I will look at Public Services International and Education International, because I think that there's a real opportunity for the organized public sector unions to mobilize their membership to do mass disinvestment of their own individual pensions because you can give a steer to your pension fund provider saying, I will not have anything to do with investment in fossil fuels. That would be incredibly transformative if it became a mass movement. And I think it's particularly true in the global north, but also many parts of the global south, that public pension funds are some of the biggest actors in the market who are actually, sadly, doing some really bad things at the moment.
Let me come in on that real quick. It's known that the biggest pension funds that are capitalized, we're talking about the capitalized, not the pay-as-you-go, are for public sector workers. And we could probably talk between EI and PSI to see how many trillions we have between CalPERS and CalSTRS and whatever. And yes, it's a good comment, and there's an interesting development. One of the biggest single pension funds, any Dutch people in the room? Raise your hands. One. One of the biggest pension funds for public sector workers is called ABP from the Netherlands. I think it has 500 billion assets under management. Look, the pensions dynamic is you invest in the lowest risk-adjusted rate of return. And for years and years, fossil fuels have been a great return. And I suspect even today, they're a phenomenal return for retirees. If you have an issue with the companies in which you invest, you do something called shareholder engagement. So as a shareholder, you seek to talk to the company and to modify their behavior. Now, typically, the trade unions seek to modify the behavior regarding labor rights. The Dutch pension fund, which is quite conservative, tried the engagement on fossil fuel companies, realized that there's no way in hell that they will stop investing in fossil fuels, regardless of what they say. As I mentioned before, they've got all these lovely green ads now, and they've gone green for everything. And that pension fund decided to divest about, what was it, about 6 months ago, 8 months ago? So normally the pension fund milieu, they all watch each other, and they want to see what the biggest pension funds are doing. So your suggestion is not new, but that's often the best suggestions are not totally innovative. And it's something we can do. Now, how much impact does an individual a pension plan member have on the behavior of the trustees, that again depends country by country. But by all means, the unions should be having this on the table. We should be having it for our trustees who sit on the board, but typically our trustees are a minority. There is no pension fund of any size on the planet that I know of where the workers are the majority, or even close. The other thing you can do is look who you bank with, because I know my paycheck goes into a bank, and then I get to use it. But how many times have I gone to my bank's annual general meeting and said, what are you doing about fossil fuels? That's something else that we can do both individually, but what we should do is we should prepare a list of the biggest banks who are the most invested so that we disseminate that in our network. So I think between EI and PSI, and maybe ITF has a little bit of public funding, and we can make a commitment to move this issue of divestment forward, because clearly shareholder engagement ain't gonna work on changing the fossil fuel companies. So I can make that commitment now. We've already started doing that. But we need to make a commitment as a collective that we will look at the banking system and our individual, or even our, should I say, organizational commitments with banks. Because I assume our organizations might have a few peanuts hidden away in a bank here and there for a rainy day. So I think on our collective, we should start putting that together. Now, what we have tried to do and we did it consciously, in part because this group has been working together now for a couple of years, is how do we create a platform where we can all meet, a neutral space, but a safe space where only organizations that agree with what we're saying can meet. And so we've built a website that we call People Over Profit, where we'll be able to collect information from different groups, and each organization will be able to sign up and then invite their own members into a space to work, whether it's on educations, on pensions, on banks, and whatever. So that's another tool that we're going to bring in the conclusion and in our follow-up steps to the 400, 800 organizations, members who have been connected to this. But can I make that commitment on behalf of EI that we'll work on this together? Power, power, yeah. We'll do that. Please, you're our mic manager. Look, I know we're getting tired, but I know there's also a party if we all behave, and if we actually end up at the closing session at Fundador. I see you pushed it back to 5:30, 6:30. How did that go? There's a microphone for you. You've got one. You've got your own mic.
So it's always been at the same hour. It's from 5:30 to 6:30 would be the synthesis session. So that's an open session to look at how the declaration has been moving forward, commented, and see how we can input into that collectively. And at 6:30, the idea is to either meet at the lobby of Hotel Fundador to walk towards the hill, it's a small hill, where the final cocktail will be, or at 7 at the cocktail that it's going to be in a hill that's, I don't know, 10 blocks to the west. So I sent out a message. Hopefully you can ask your sectors to forward that message. And it has the Google Maps that gives all the information. So just to recap, it's at 5:30. Hotel Fundador is the synthesis session. It's going to be in Sala Gobernador, second floor on the second building for those who have been there in other sessions. And at 6:30, we start walking from Hotel Fundador towards the final cocktail. And this final space it's not going to be a panel. It's going to be food, drinks, be with people we've been meeting these last few days. Hopefully some open mic for some people to give some final remarks. And I don't know. That's it. And it closes at 9, so we can't be there until very late.
At what?
At 9.
A 2-hour party?
It's a 2-hour cocktail. After that, we're going to have to get creative.
Okay? Okay. Well, we do have time for more comments, but I can try with the help of a few people who have been paying attention and taking notes to try to draw out some of the key strands that we're likely to work on and progress. But let's see if there's any more calls for the mic. Seeing one.
Thank you. It's something that hasn't come up, for which perhaps I have some reflections, and that is the green parties. The green parties that exist in many of the countries of the North. Are they allies? Are they not? If we agree that it is capitalism that is responsible for climate change and not human beings, basically, it is very clear that the route for us as activists is going to be confrontation. I mean, this is becoming very clear from what everybody here says. And if we're talking about confrontation, we have to understand if there is no such a confrontation, there will be no change at all. That's the way I see it. Because to me, gradualism at this point where tomorrow is today is inaction. Gradualism is inaction. So passive resistance will become absolutely in vain if we want to leave anything to our children and the next generations. So for me, what has been lacking in this discussion this morning and today is what is the logic that as activists we have to take or organize around for making the changes that are needed, that have been repeated ad nauseum in these sessions with excessive details. The points have been well taken, but people expand themselves very often in details that don't add to the main point. So we basically have done a lot to predict the future in the interventions that we have had throughout the 4 days, but we have done much less is to create the future through our intervention. It's on our shoulders. It's not on the Green parties, and I invite other opinions about it, and it's not on the state, definitely on the governments. If you look how the United Nations works, it's disgusting in which we as civil society have the good positions, pro-planet, pro-life, pro-health, and pro the 7 things that we discussed in the different thematic groups here. And we present those forcefully in the international fora only to be defeated at a point where the chairperson says that only the nation states vote, and you have a bunch of diplomatic bureaucrats in New York, in Geneva, and in Rome that basically receive orders from the capital, even if they're in favor of what we are saying, and they fill out our final declarations with brackets of all type, and as I said earlier, we end up discussing until the wee hours only to dilute, and invariably for our representatives in these things to leave with a low morale.
Okay, following that, any other comments and enlightenments of?
Buenas tardes a todas, a todos, a todes. Pido permiso a mis abuelas y a mis abuelos para traer la palabra y espero que los corazones de estos seres y sus abuelos y abuelas puedan escuchar con sus corazones. Una cosa que nos une a todos es esta sensación de desesperación. Es como que estuviésemos buscando soluciones y aparecen las comunidades, aparecen hermanos de África, hermanos de América Latina, hermanos de Europa, hermanos hablan de lo global. Hay términos acá que he aprendido estos 4 días que antes no tenía ni idea. Y queda tristemente claro que si el modelo continúa, es absolutamente imposible que sobrevivamos como raza humana. ¿Cuánto estamos dispuestos a abandonar esas supuestas comodidades que nos dio el capitalismo desde el siglo XX? No sé. No sé si estamos dispuestos. Parecería que todo lo que queremos es solucionar para seguir con este mismo sistema perverso y asesino. Es un sistema asesino que comete lo que nosotros, desde el movimiento de mujeres indígenas por el buen vivir, llamamos terricidio. Como es imposible, hay abuelos amazónicos, hay abuelos y abuelas de la nación Navajo, hay abuelos y abuelas de ciertas comunidades y pueblos y naciones que conocen lo que llaman plantas sagradas. Las plantas sagradas, todas son plantas sagradas, pero hay plantas sagradas que en el mundo occidental le llaman psicoactivas. Pero son plantas que hace cientos de miles de años que están. Los hermanos, abuelos, abuelas amazónicas usan estas plantas hace muchos siglos. Y hace unos años esas plantas empezaron a viajar o personas empezaron a viajar a encontrarse con esas plantas. Y empezaron a suceder cosas, parece de cuento, pero muy interesantes. Esas plantas ayudaron a mucha gente a encontrar un camino de la vida. Y hubo mucha gente que andaba en cosas muy feas. Y con esas plantas supieron para dónde ir, hicieron trabajos para, no sé, compensar o reparar, si es posible. Yo no creo en las reparaciones. La muerte, no hay manera de traerla, ¿no?, a la vida. La muerte es muerte. Pero quizá todos los activistas, todas ustedes, deberían encontrar esas plantas, porque quizá sería un camino para saber qué hacer. Porque con este sistema es imposible. Pero si se animan a dejarlo y a renunciar y a dejar cosas y a vivir de día y no de noche, y hay un montón de cosas que se podrían hacer, pero hay que decidirlo. Entonces, creo que la naturaleza está la solución de absolutamente todo. La Madre Tierra nos da la vida y nos da las medicinas. Y esas medicinas han llegado y han viajado, que antes no viajaban, hace unos 20 años que viajan, justamente para intentar ayudar en todas estas cosas que estamos tan atrapados. Porque si no, este sentido de la desesperación y la falta de esperanza realmente es terrible, sobre todo para los que ya somos ancianos y tenemos esta obligación de dejarle a nuestros nietos un mundo un poquito mejor y nos vamos claramente con un mundo peor.
So, I'm not, yep, hey, ye-
Hola, buenas tardes. Me llamo Josep, vengo del Observatorio de la Deuda en la Globalización, ODG. He llegado un poco tarde, pero por eso pido disculpas, lo primero de todo, pero entiendo que este es un taller de justicia climática y en ningún momento he escuchado la palabra justicia global, ¿no? O algo referente que para nosotros en el ODG lo entendemos que está completamente vinculado, lo que es la justicia climática con la justicia global. En el sentido de que hay una palabra que creo que hace mucho miedo al norte global, sobre todo, ¿no? Que es el decrecimiento, ¿no? Antes la compañera ha hablado de que tenemos que dejar de crecer para poder respetar lo que son los límites biofísicos del planeta, pero entiendo que hay una parte de justicia global que debemos tener en cuenta desde el norte, ¿no? Y como ahora comentaba la compañera, ¿no? La reparación a lo mejor a veces no sirve, pero sí que debemos tenerlo muy presente de que todos los impactos que hemos generado en el norte, pues esta vez, pues con esta justicia climática, debemos tenerlo en cuenta. Y yo vengo del ámbito de la energía y para mí la transición energética justamente es una oportunidad para hacer esto, en el sentido de dejar de plantear, ¿no? Un colonialismo, un extractivismo verde hacia el sur por parte del norte y realmente replantearnos cuáles son los usos energéticos necesarios socialmente para poder sostener la vida, para poder reproducirla en el norte y no tanto como estas cumbres como las COP, ¿no? Que nunca se resuelve nada, ¿no? Porque justamente los países del norte son los que no quieren renunciar a nada y quieren adoctrinar, ¿no? A los países del sur cómo se tienen que hacer las cosas. Por lo tanto, yo creo que es importante que hagamos esta reflexión, sobre todo desde los países del norte y no tanto poner estas presiones sobre los países del sur. Gracias.
Maybe one more thing that might be worth taking down is looking at climate protests and how it's involved. We've seen a lot of crackdowns, a lot of repression, a lot of violence against young people standing up and protesting in the streets. And that also extends to being expelled from school, etc., for the strikes. And I think the further the climate crisis will progress, it will also change the nature of climate activism. We've been seeing that quite a lot recently in Europe. We have young activists, these museums actions where tomato soup is pulled over a painting that is protected by a glass foil. But if you listen to what conservative politicians are taking out of this in terms of the narrative, they are being framed as terrorists, they're being framed as enemies of the state for bringing attention to the most crucial cause that we have. So I think if we can add something that relates to protecting the right to protest, the right for activism, and making sure that these protests are not framed in a manner of terrorism, which is unfortunately really the case in the discourse in Europe at the moment.
Not only Europe, sadly enough. We're seeing it all over the world. So I'm going to try to pull out the themes without taking too much time. Clearly, communities as key actors and how to engage our communities both in developing information and in awareness raising. And Emilia, I was part of your movie making event. I know that a lot of people now are connected permanently on their phones, but the attention span is a minute, 2 minutes for video messages. And I mean, PSI is doing the same thing. We're moving messages in much shorter snaps. And I think we need to be sharing the messages. We need to, again, have a place where we can see which messages concern what issues so that we can build on and share. I know that in El Peru, the union of FENTAP has been constantly putting out material on what are the issues with privatization, because why would somebody in a community care about water privatization unless they get better information? It's not inherently something that you are born opposing. And in many instances, they do a really good job. So somehow we've got to gather that. Again, I come back to this concept of the people over profit website, which we may need to rebrand as Nuestro Futuro es Público website, so that we can put things in and tag them so that you can find them. Because oftentimes it's getting them and finding them. And then people who work in the communities can advise and also provide information. I think Emilia's proposal on caps and limits on mining, I'm waiting for a 2-page brief from you, Emilia, to show what it means, what it can mean internationally. I understand that AMLO has issued a presidential decree that may not be able to be repeated so easily around the world, but I think the idea is totally interesting, and I hope you've made a lot of contacts here in Chile, specifically on lithium mining and the progressive policies that could come out. Archer's debt boycott and other similar initiatives. I guess your paper won't be 2 pages. It'll probably be a bit longer. 1 page, you promise? I mean, the idea is one worth examining. It's absolutely, I think, something that's going to take some serious organizing and serious considerations of the implications, whether it is the comment about, yeah, you do that and they'll paralyze your economy. And it's not just the IMF who will do it, but Standard & Poor's, Fitch's, and Moody's. So I think it's worth, of course, exploring and connecting with the Jubilee movement for their expertise. And so we need to see that. In terms of commercial boycotts, I would also suggest, and it was hinted at here, a boycott of Coca-Cola. I mean, what do they produce that's any good for anybody on the planet? This is something I've never understood. Why don't we stop buying that shit? Now, there may be slight addictions to sugar and to caffeine, but yeah. But I think corporate boycotts are complex. They take organizing, they take a key motivating element, and they take their own logic, but I think they need to be considered. Corporate boycotts are a tool. Another question of the definition of what is public. Public is not government. We are public. And so how do we take that message? Because the problem is we have become too distant from our governments because either we're too busy working 2 jobs or 3, because we're too busy with this or that, or because our brains have been somehow distracted by everything that's on these things, screens of one sort or another. How do we rebuild? And this is an issue I haven't heard here, but I was sort of hinting at it, is where we can do this is where we live. And where we live, we can get engaged in the political process probably more easily than we can get engaged in the national level. And so how many, for example, trade union leaders get elected to city councils? How many activists get elected to city councils and then do the right thing? Because it doesn't, just because you get elected doesn't mean you do the right thing necessarily. But also it's because that's where the notion of public is most real for you. When you need a service, you don't want to fly or drive to the capital. You want the public service where you live, and you want it on a daily basis or on an emergency basis. So I think we've got to look in as a movement at our own community structures and retaking them from the corporate influence. I suspect the corporate influence is much more focused on national, where the finance minister is, the tax minister is, and all these subsidies and legislations are developed. So we may have less corporate interference in cities and villages and towns, but clearly the whole question of corporate capture of our governments. Why is there corporate capture? Probably because we left a vacuum. And so how do we organize to get back into our governments and make them accountable to us? the notion of public services as a fulcrum, as a leverage for our climate fight, I think is fundamental, because the market is not going to solve our climate chaos. It just won't. And so if we can activate that from a climate perspective and link that to, you know, democratizing or putting people in charge of our common public institutions, I think that's very solid. Fossil fuel subsidies. I know the subsidies question can be very tricky and complex, and so I don't know if there's a victim, I mean a volunteer here to help us unpack that. Who was it who talked about fossil fuel subsidies? Raise your hand. You did? Pass the buck, okay. Look, I get it that we need to look into fossil fuel subsidies. I suspect there are experts who are doing it. So you don't want to just cut them all, just like you don't want to cut subsidies for grain or rice, or because we are addicted to fossil fuels in more ways than we even know, in more ways than we can even think. Agreed, we need to move away from them. How's the best way? But I think the divesting, we've already agreed to push that forward. I mean, we're already working on it. We've got some big pension funds, but I think that needs to be divesting from them. It means also that their cost of capital, if our pension funds and our banks aren't providing easy capital, their cost of capital goes up, so they may do less drilling and less exploring and signing less royalties. I think it's clear we need to connect automatically to tax justice. We need to look at the trade deals, the various ones. I mentioned the European-based Energy Charter Treaty, which locks in the use of fossil fuels and allows the companies to sue the governments if they try to use less fossil fuels. But that's throughout the whole global trade system, whether it's bilaterals, multilaterals, globals. What did I forget, folks? I'm sure I forgot some stuff, but let's see who took more notes than me. Huh? The role of the legislative branch.
Just 30 seconds, perhaps add, which is the role that we can play as social movements in trying to get the windshield profits that the corporations have gotten through the pandemic and through the war in Europe in order to sequester some of the funds, or taxing or finding the way, which is something that not only social movements are requesting. President Biden is mentioning in his own speeches that these corporations, especially the energy corporations and the pharmaceutical houses, that have made significant profits that are way above the average profits. And we can tap into that money for all the things that need to be done, not only for climate change, but for social justice, that our friend from Spain was saying. Perhaps that could be added.
Okay. Look, I know the whole issue of corporate subsidies and identifying the corporations and doing your due diligence on the corporations and finding out who they're linked to and who they're bribing, who they're, all of that stuff is really crucial. We need to understand the corporations better. And again, on a lot of these issues, there are specialized organizations who dig into various of these. I think of one of our allies in Europe, the Corporate Europe Observatory and the Observatoire des Multinationales, and ODG. You guys do a fair bit on some of these things. So there is work being done there. How do we collect it? How do we connect it? How do we use it? How do we make others aware of it? And luckily, I can say, with the advances in in the internet and in algorithms, machine translation is getting better and better. Because this was always a barrier for us. We're in 150 countries, and for us, each word translated cost 15 cents, 25 cents per language. It's hugely expensive. So we do need to move things into different languages and make them translated. Rodrigo, I see you have a microphone.
Yeah, it's just something that I think Claudio mentioned it, but I think it's what we've been saying when he was questioning this, what about the green parties? I was thinking that at least on our messaging, we should try to say that green politics and green policies must empower and strengthen public services. We should link those two worlds. And then the other way around, like the public service movement should be part of the green transition and just transition movement as well. But I think it's interesting, like, to demand that of green parties or of any party that describes themselves as green. Well, where's your public service component? It doesn't exist without that part. And I think it's something we've said, but it could be good to try to include it in what's coming out of the declaration or stuff like that.
Well, good luck in getting additional words in the declaration, Rodrigo, because I know what they're trying to do is keep it to 2 pages. And right now I'm already getting like 4 pages of bullet points. On the question of whether green parties are allies of public services, the answer is not automatically. A number of green parties are still looking for market-based solutions because the market is just so endemic and so systemic. So we can't assume that green parties are our natural allies, and that probably means we have some work to do there on political. Who else is grabbing a mic? I think I saw a mic moving somewhere. If not, I've asked for if I've forgotten stuff.
Bueno, yo soy Álvaro Ferreira, soy de Madrid, representante de un sindicato de Metro de Madrid. Nosotros somos defensores de lo público, siempre, ¿cuáles son las formas de luchar? Estoy escuchando cómo llegar a los gobiernos. A los gobiernos se les llega poniendo a la gente en la calle y pidiendo y exigiendo las cosas en la calle y luchando por lo público, luchando por un transporte público en las grandes ciudades, por quitar el coche privado y siempre todo se hace con lucha y defendiendo lo que... Bueno, quería apoyar al compañero que ha hablado de crecimiento, yo creo que es importante, o de crecemos o morimos. Y echo de menos algo que no se ha dicho aquí, que es el tema de la alimentación, de cómo la alimentación ganadera contribuye a las emisiones de carbono a la atmósfera, y creo que es un tema bastante importante y no he participado de todas las jornadas, pero no he escuchado a nadie comentarlo, a ver qué pensabais sobre eso. Muchas gracias.
Emilia.
I just wanted to share an experience we had because we work with gender responsive budgeting. And so we are developing this methodology on climate change. So this is really a good way to link public services with our bigger aims for policies, but also programming and normative frameworks. So we trained 2 cities, Mexico City and Tlaxcala. Mexico City is huge, it's a monster. Tlaxcala is really small. And it was quite a challenge because we were training all of the sectors, but in particular we were emphasizing to have the Minister of Environment and the Ministry of Gender Equality. And we thought we would have to train the Minister of Environment on gender and the Ministry of Gender on Environment. Turns out we had to train the Ministry on Environment on climate change because they had no idea what it was, that they had a specific mandate, what is it that they could do with their local mandate, etc. Many things. They could not distinguish what was pollution versus what were measures to address climate change, what were the measures they could do on mitigation, on adaptation, etc. On the field of gender, they were working on the day of the Mother's Day and, you know, all of those usual things that are adding an extra burden of unpaid domestic and care work. So we had to teach them how that related to climate change and how they needed to do fiscal policy and not radio shows and whatever. So it was really tough. It was really tough, and we managed to intervene the state program on environment so that we could have human rights, gender equality, intergenerational equity, all of those things, plus the program on gender equality.
And we made it also to the programmatic framework. And when we were about to get to the budgetary framework, COVID came. And so everything has been stalled because virtually it has been very difficult to follow up now that there's a new administration. So, but I just wanted to share as well that working with states is really also a very important key. It's a long-term process, but it's also very meaningful because you can really impact on the ground. Especially the case on Tlaxcala showed us that people get the immediate benefit right there. But then it is a long bet. So just inviting feminists here, if you are working with this tool, it's not just about budgets, it's about programming, planning, and the normative framework, which we usually forget, but we are always trying to include the normative side and working with the legislative. So just to put it out there that this is really a good point of entry for civil society, even if it's consultative with the communities, to bring in public services immediately.
When you were saying working with states, were you meaning subnational governments?
Yeah, Mexico City and Tlaxcala and several municipalities working there. But we can do it. We have been doing that federally, but it's more difficult, but very directly with subnational.
Yeah. I think that's right. The potential is there, and there's a lot of experiments going on in cities. Oh, there's a hand way back there. What are you doing way back there? How do you expect to attract our attention when you sit in the back? Yeah, but lucky you. Anyways, so I think cities and subnational is really a potential. There's lots of stuff going on. Please.
So just a very quick question, and I've been reflecting on, sorry, Anuj Kapalashwamy. I'm professor in global health policy and equity in University of Essex, and also a long-standing member of People's Health Movement, MedAct, and Health Poverty Action. We've heard through the last couple of days and been enthused about the idea of international solidarity, building solidarity across movements and the intersectionality of different justice movements, where gender justice, climate justice, and so on. I'm just wondering if the speakers could also reflect on some of the challenges in working internationally and expressing that international solidarity in contexts where you're seeing rising nationalism and in the kind of geopolitical tensions that we are seeing today. We've seen several examples of these. Most recently in the climate justice context was the farmer struggles in India, and how any gesture and any initiative of extending that solidarity from international communities was met with a lot of resistance and worsened the situations for sort of local activism. So just some reflections on how does one navigate those tensions.
Thank you.
Thank you. I am Nessim Ashush from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. I agree with the lot of points that have been made just now. But I think when we were talking about public ownership, there is one thing that we haven't really mentioned is the question of this also means regaining sovereignty and sovereignty about public services that have been often sold out and that have been marketized. So when we look at climate justice, what we definitely need is to regain the capability of impulsing new measures, new ways of fighting the climate crisis. And I think this is, I understand the need to address different levels, and definitely the level of cities and municipalities is one level. But I think if you don't really have a vision about what a democratic state means in those times, and in that moment we are in, with having a matrix that is able to really incorporate the needs to have communities and different experiences being included, but also the possibility of planning those policies that we need, of envisioning them at a larger scale. We will not be able to regain those services and to invent new models as well. So I think I agree with the comrade that was mentioning the possibility to start also from existing proposals. And I think that the case of Colombia is a good one right now. And what do we do with those proposals when they seem to be going in the right direction? We can discuss them, reform them, but I think we need to go from what's actually existing on the table and to try to develop this vision together.
Thank you, Nassim. Look, I know this is one thing that's come up a fair bit. It's amazing how many public servants actually are supposed to do the work on planning and assessing and looking what the needs are, and they've all been outsourced, and all that work is being done by KPMG and Deloitte Touche, and we need to understand that those are specialties that we also need, and that we need to connect to those people. Look, unless nobody else puts their hand up, including Archer, I think we've had a good discussion. I'm going to try to hammer some of this out into something that might look like, no.
Thank you very much.
I'm trying. Eddie.
Yes. I maybe I have missed a lot of this conversation because I was having another strategic meeting. I just want to start by a small story. Let's say you are from Spain, you take your holidays, you come to Senegal, right? Because we have nice beaches, to take rest, to buy fish it, grill it, all these things, you spend money. Then why, me as a young people living from Senegal, I have to leave, drop all that, take the boat for 1 week to come to Spain and risk my life? It makes no sense. It's because why you're paying a lot to come there to enjoy that potential, I cannot have it anymore as someone who lives there. So this is showing how linked is the struggle, the issue I'm facing, and you in your other country. Because I'm a fisher, I'm an island man. Because of the level of acidification of the water which is rising, I cannot find fish here anymore. Because the water intrusion, I cannot cultivate anymore. So this is climate change. And because of that, I'm now migrating. So isn't it time to see the migration through the lens of climate change? I think this intersectionality that we're talking about is implying more than thematics, but issues, how they are linked. I think talking about public services is also talking about that, how climate change is, pushing for migration and creating also other problems, the land access, because of climate migrants leaving the islands to go join some other places. We can think about that. What do we plan in a very legal framework to host them to live in harmony without seeing this hunt, this threat? This is something we should think about. So one last element is, in a very political way, during the meetings, like the strategic COP, stuff like that, our countries, our governments, they go there. They take the commitment to contribute reducing their carbon emission through the National Adaptation Plan, Communication National, stuff like that. But when they come, what we see is they continue exploiting their natural resources, their oil, because they need it for the development purpose. How can we take these two different positioning? Saying that I'm going to reduce my carbon emission and I'm going to exploit my oil and my fuel because I need it in terms of development. So it's contradictory. How can we just, in a global agenda, how can we push this government to be more accountable, to be clear in their positioning? Either I'm protecting the environment, being green by process, or I'm just pushing for my country development and not taking any other commitment. Because taking that commitment is opening them the door to have fundings. And that fundings will be used in a way that we already know. So I just want us to have this reflection around that, knowing that it's good that we focus on money, the issues, the opportunities in a financial way, but in a more strategic, in a more holistic also, think about that, how to pose this conversation. Thank you.
Last call. Last call. Going once, twice. Do I hear a motion to adjourn? First of all, thanking our interpreters. Thank you, interpreters. Thanking our audio and tech boys. Gracias, compañeros. They've got now to unbuild this whole thing, and so they don't get to go to the party, I don't think. No, they're probably building the party. So thanks to our audio-video guys, even though I don't envy them having to take pictures of me. And thanks to all of you and all the people who have been following online, because there have been people following online, but there is a void in having their comments because I was not hooked onto their screen. And we actually should have had somebody just doing that to bring their comments in. And my apologies to anybody online who only got to listen. That's got to be very frustrating. Thanks to you all. And we'll see you at 5:30 or probably 7 for most of you. One page, huh?